In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers pitched a tent on a remote slope in Russia's Ural Mountains. By morning, that tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers were gone. Some were barefoot, some were in their underwear, in temperatures that dropped past minus 25 degrees Celsius. When searchers finally found them, weeks apart across a snow-covered forest, the injuries made no sense. Crushed ribs with no bruising, a fractured skull with no blow, missing eyes, a missing tongue. Soviet investigators looked at it all and, in an official report, wrote down only this: a compelling natural force. Then they closed the case. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and after 65 years, we may finally understand what happened.
The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in what was then the Soviet Union. Igor was known as careful, methodical, the kind of hiker who double-checked every strap on his pack. He recruited 8 friends and classmates for the trip: Zinaida Kolmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolovadov, and Nikolai Fibo-Brinyol. All were experienced skiers in their early 20s. Joining them was one outsider, Semyon Zolotaryov, a 37-year-old sports instructor, older than the rest and a late addition to the group. Their goal was to reach the summit of Mount Otorten and back, over 200 miles through the northern Urals in the dead of winter, a Category 3 route, the hardest classification that existed. If they finished it, they'd earn their highest hiking certification. For most of them, it was far from their first expedition like this.
On January 23, 1959, the 10 of them boarded a train out of Sverdlovsk, and by the 27th, they were deep into the wilderness, following the Lozva River on skis. That's when one member, Yuri Yudin, started struggling. An old back injury, sciatica, was flaring up in the cold. Reluctantly, he said goodbye to his friends at a remote outpost and turned back alone. He would go on to live until 2013, the only member of the group who ever came home. The remaining 9 skied on. On February 1st, they began climbing toward a bald, treeless slope on the eastern side of a mountain the local Mansi people called Holat Saihach. In their language, it means dead mountain, though it had earned that name from an old legend long before Dyatlov's group ever set foot there.
By late afternoon, the weather was turning. Heavy wind, falling visibility. Dyatlov made a decision that, in hindsight, cost them everything. Rather than descend to the shelter of the tree line, the group set up camp directly on the open slope of Holat Syakhl. Photos developed later from their own cameras show them cutting into the snow to level a platform for the tent, laying skis down as a floor, settling in for the night. It's a small, practical detail, cutting a shelf into a snow-covered slope that seemed harmless at the time. Decades later, it would become the key to the entire mystery. That night, the group ate dinner, and based on their diaries and the relaxed tone of their last photographs, there is no evidence anyone in the tent expected anything was wrong. Sometime after nightfall, something happened inside that tent, something violent and fast enough that 9 trained, experienced hikers didn't stop to dress. They didn't put on their boots. Several didn't even grab a coat. Instead, using knives, they cut their way out of the tent canvas from the inside and ran. Investigators later reconstructed their path. Footprints in the snow, some in socks, some barefoot, walking, not sprinting, but walking with purpose, down the slope, away from the tent, toward the safety of a forest more than a kilometer below. No signs of a struggle inside the tent, no signs anyone else had been there. Whatever it was, it came from somewhere they couldn't fight, and the only response 9 capable people could agree on, wordlessly and immediately, was to leave everything behind and get off that slope. 26 days later, a search party found the abandoned tent, half buried in snow. Inside, they found the group's boots, warm clothes, food, money, everything they needed to survive, left behind. Following the trail of footprints down toward the forest, searchers reached a large cedar tree. At its base, were the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko in torn underclothes with burns on their hands. Branches up to 5 meters high had been broken off the tree, as if someone had climbed it, trying to see something or get away from something on the ground. Near a small extinguished fire, investigators found scraps of clothing that had clearly been cut from the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, as though the living had stripped warmer layers off the dead, trying to keep the others alive just a little longer.
Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. Each was found alone, at different distances, in postures that suggested they'd been trying to climb back up the slope, back toward the tent, back toward warmth and supplies. Slobodin had a hairline skull fracture, though not one investigators believed was severe enough to be fatal on its own. All 3 showed signs consistent with death by hypothermia. It appeared the group had split in that final hour, some staying by the tree, some pushing forward, and some trying and failing to make it back.
It took another 2 months to find the last 4. On May 4th, deep in a ravine nearly 70 meters from the cedar tree, searchers found Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, buried under 4 meters of snow. They had built a den here, laying cedar branches down to keep off the frozen ground. Proof that at least 4 of them survived long enough to plan, to build, to try to wait it out. These 4 had the worst injuries of the group. Thibault-Brignol had a major skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov both had severe chest trauma, fractures investigators compared to the kind of blunt force seen in a car crash. And yet there was almost no external bruising on any of them, no sign of what exactly had hit them. Dubinina's tongue and eyes were missing, which, combined with everything else, is what turned this from a tragedy into a 65-year-old obsession.
On paper, none of it added up. Investigators found no soft tissue bruising to match the internal trauma, as if the bodies had been crushed by pressure rather than struck. Several pieces of clothing tested positive for radioactivity, above what officials at the time considered a safe limit. And oddest of all, witnesses in villages dozens of miles away reported seeing strange, glowing orange spheres drifting in the sky that same week. Faced with a stack of evidence that contradicted itself at every turn, the Soviet inquest folded. In May 1959, less than a month after the last bodies were recovered, the case was formally closed. The official cause of death, printed in the files, death caused by a compelling natural force. No further explanation was given, and the files were sealed for decades. With no real answer, people filled in the blanks. Some Russians believed the KGB was covering up a secret military weapons test gone wrong. The radiation and the orange lights in the sky seemed to fit. Others pointed to the region's folklore and blamed a mink, the Russian equivalent of a yeti. A more recent documentary theory suggested infrasound, low-frequency wind vibrations generated by the shape of the slope itself that are known to cause panic, nausea, and a sense of dread in humans, even though they can't be heard. It's a genuinely fascinating phenomenon, but there's still no physical evidence tying it to this specific night. None of these theories, however dramatic, have ever been backed by hard forensic evidence. What they do share is a common root. For 60 years, the one thing that never satisfied anyone was the Soviet Union's original answer. A compelling natural force isn't an explanation, it's a shrug. That changed in 2019 when Russia's Prosecutor General's office, under pressure from the victims' families, formally reopened the investigation. Lead investigator Andrei Kuryakov proposed something that had actually been suggested decades earlier and dismissed: an avalanche. The problem was the slope. At roughly 17 to 20 degrees, it wasn't nearly steep enough to match the classic textbook avalanche most people picture. Critics pointed out that rescuers found no obvious avalanche debris when they reached the site weeks later, and no locals had ever reported one on that slope before. If it was an avalanche, it wasn't a normal one.
And for the theory to hold up, someone needed to explain how.
2 years later, in 2021, 2 Swiss scientists took on the challenge. Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer at ETH Zurich, and Johann Gaumi, an avalanche researcher at EPFL, built a detailed physical model of that exact slope, the wind patterns, the snow accumulation, and one critical detail everyone had overlooked. To pitch their tent, the hikers had cut into the snowpack, carving a small ledge into the slope above them. That cut, combined with hours of strong katabatic winds packing snow into a dense slab above the campsite, created exactly the conditions needed for a delayed slab avalanche. Not a roaring wall of snow, but a smaller, slower slide, releasing hours after the cut was made, hitting the tent with enough force to cause serious injury without leaving the dramatic debris field of a typical avalanche. To test whether that kind of impact could actually cause the group's injuries, they turned to an unlikely source: 1970s General Motors crash test data, originally collected using cadavers to help design safer seatbelts. The comparison lined up. A slab impact like the one they modeled could absolutely produce internal trauma with no external bruising, exactly what the autopsies had shown 60 years earlier.
That single finding helped explain almost everything else. Injured and disoriented, in complete darkness, the group made the only decision they could: get away from the unstable slope and reach the tree line. The radiation on their clothing traces back to something far less mysterious than a weapons test. Yuri Krivonishenko had spent time helping with cleanup after the Kishtim disaster, a major nuclear accident that had happened in the same region just 2 years earlier, and some contamination likely traveled with him. The glowing orange spheres reported by villagers are now widely believed to have been Soviet missile tests, launched from a site hundreds of miles away, unrelated to the hikers entirely. And the missing tongue and eyes on Lyudmila Dubinina's body, the detail that fueled decades of horror movie theories, is now attributed to something far more mundane and far more likely: 3 months of exposure, running meltwater, and ordinary scavenging animals.
To be clear, the slab avalanche theory isn't a perfect, universally accepted ending. Some researchers still question why experienced hikers, capable of recognizing avalanche risk, chose that slope at all. Others note that Soviet-era paperwork from the case has never been fully released, and some of it appears to have been altered after the fact. As recently as the past few years, relatives of the hikers, represented by lawyers combing back through the original 1959 case files, have continued pushing Russian authorities to reopen the investigation once more, unconvinced that even the slab avalanche theory tells the whole story. 65 years later, the Dyatlov Pass incident is, for the first time, scientifically explainable. Whether it's fully solved is still, in a way, up to who you ask.
9 people went into the mountains that winter, prepared for almost everything a hiking trip could throw at them. Everything except the one thing that actually happened. And in a strange way, that's what keeps this story alive after 65 years. It isn't really about aliens or the KGB or a Yeti in the tree line. It's about how much can still go wrong, even when you do everything right. If you want to go deeper into cases like this, mysteries with real evidence, real science, and real endings, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.